as 10 survivalists, or 10 people who basically live without support from the community around, and they were dropped into 10 different spots in the Canadian Arctic. The one person who lasts for 100 days alone will win $1 million. The participants have to build their own shelter, harvest their own food, and find ways to deal with being completely and utterly alone for 100 days through fall and part of the winter in the Arctic. Now, while the biggest initial challenge is finding food, creating shelter, and ensuring their safety, ultimately, what causes most people to drop out of the challenge is being alone. They struggle with missing their families, missing their children's birthdays, having no one to talk to, finding meaningful activities when they are bored, too much time to think about their lives and all the regrets they have, along with total loneliness. Those are the elements that cause the most talented of the participants to suffer. There's nothing much worse in life than the feeling of being unwillingly and completely alone. That feeling of being alone, unloved, unlovable, and unloving is about the worst thing that can happen to us. When those feelings overtake us, and let's be honest, sometimes they do, most of us don't know where to turn or what to do. And the only thing that really helps us when we feel alone is God's grace. God's grace is God's love put into action for us. God's grace is God taking action to remind us that we are not alone. God's grace is God taking action that shows that we are deeply loved, that God will do anything and everything to help us experience God's love and presence. God's love and God's presence are God's grace to us. Now, Psalm 139 was written as an ode to God's grace. It talks about the three flavors of grace that God offers to us, and those flavors of grace are prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. When the psalmist said, "Wherever I go, God is already there," the psalmist was talking about God's prevenient grace. Prevenient grace is God's love that is always present. Now it says, "You hem me in front of me and behind me." I love the King James. "Thou dost beset me behind and before." I don't like a lot of King James, but that one I do. "Thou dost beset me behind and before." But anyway, and that's prevenient grace. Wherever we are, God is already there. When we think we can run away from God, God is already there. Wherever we are, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and as my mother would say, financially, and every other way, God is already there. That is prevenient grace. Because God's love is everywhere, we simply cannot escape from God's grace. Now, the second flavor is justifying grace. Justifying grace is found in God's forgiveness for our past and a promise of new life in this world and in the world to come. Justifying grace is that grace that makes us right with God. It is that grace that aligns us with God. It is that grace that justifies us with God. It's like measuring for a wall. We justify the line, right? We make sure it gets in line with the line that's already there, the true line. Justifying grace is that moment when we accept that God, through Jesus, can redeem even us. It's that moment when we are convinced that Jesus is our Christ, and that what is in the past is forgiven, and that the future holds new life for us in this world and the next. And then the rest of our lives are spent in God's sanctifying grace. Sanctify, make holy. We're still going to mess up, and in fact, most of us mess up on a regular basis, and we do it the same way over and over and over again. But when we're finally ready to change, the Holy Spirit goes to work on us and changes us from the inside out. As the Holy Spirit changes us, we begin to get more and more glimpses of what it's like to live as a follower of Jesus. As the Holy Spirit goes to work on us, we get more and more glimpses of God's perfection in love in this world. Those moments when it feels like all is right with the world, and we're there in the midst of that rightness, that's God's sanctifying grace. Now, there's not going to be a test, so don't worry if you don't remember. Now, God's grace is an amazing miracle of God's love for us. Sadly, however, too many of us simply forget that God's grace is always available to us. We forget that God's love and God's mercy are always present. We forget that we can never really be alone because God is always where we are before we get there. We forget that God has already gone where we're going, and there are no heights or depths of emotions. There are no heights or depths on the planet where God is not already there. And we forget. Is it making sense so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. We forget because we're not very spiritually literate. We haven't learned how to read God's presence in our lives. We haven't learned how to recognize that God is always present wherever we are, inside or outside. Spiritual literacy is that ability to read, recognize, and respond to God's presence in our everyday lives. Those moments when we look at what's going on in the world around us and feel God's closeness, we feel God's presence, is a moment of spiritual literacy because we understand what we are seeing. Spiritual literacy doesn't allow us to forget about God's grace because we recognize God in our surroundings and we know that we're not alone. We know that we're surrounded by God's presence, God's love, and God's hope for the future. Now the thing is, practicing spiritual literacy is like practicing learning how to read. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes concentration to learn how to read. When we learn how to read, first we have to learn the alphabet. Remember that? It was in first grade for me. Yeah, now kids are advanced, they do it in preschool. Bless them. But it's learning the alphabet. And then learning that there's a long vowel and a short vowel, A and E. Who knew? Learning that C is C and K. You know, it's learning the alphabet and all the ways that they can sound. And then it's learning how to put letters of the alphabet together to form words. And we practice reading the same combinations of letters until we automatically know what those letter combinations say when we see them. For instance, who remembers the first word in our very first reading book? Yeah, actually the first word was look. Look. Look, Jane, look. Look, look, look. Look at Spot. Run, Spot. Run, run, run. Oh, oh, oh. Funny, funny Spot. Remember the first time you saw the word look somewhere other than your Dick and Jane reading book? It might have been on the magazine book. It might have been on a billboard. It might have been on a television ad. Remember how excited you were when you could say, oh my gosh, I know that word, look! And poor mom and dad. Oh, that's so good, honey. Oh, we're so proud of you. Ay, 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 how long does this go on? They never knew it went on for about another 40 years. But we put those words together, and suddenly, the world is exciting because we can make sense of what we're seeing. Suddenly, those letters that before were foreign to us, meant nothing, become meaningful. And it's an exciting time. Well, spiritual literacy takes the same kind of practice and the same kind of time, and the results are even more exciting than learning how to read Look, Jane, Look. Because spiritual literacy begins with seeing and feeling something that we recognize as God's presence right here in our world. And we know that every time we see that, every time we experience that, we are in the presence of God. And spiritual literacy is like reading, because once we start recognizing God's presence in one thing, we can begin to recognize God's presence in more things. But like reading, it takes practice to continue to build our capacity to recognize God. But we start with just one thing, one word, one experience, or one feeling that helps us to experience God in the same way that we can read by looking at a grouping of letters. And the more we experience practicing, the more we experience God's presence, the more we begin to realize that God is always with us. So the assignment today is for each of us to think of that one place, or that one feeling, or that one moment when we can say, yeah, that's God's presence. I recognize that. And every time I see that, or feel that, or experience that, I know I'm in the presence of God, just like being able to see the word look. And once we know what that one thing is, we can always go back to it in our heads. Now, it could be the warmth of the sun, it could be the face of the grandchild, it could be the sound of birds, it could be the face or the presence of our partner, it could be flowers in the garden. Whatever it is for each of us, our assignment is to name that one thing. Because once we can name and experience God's presence in one thing, we can start looking for the next thing. And eventually, with practice, we're going to be able to recognize God's presence in everything we see, everything we hear, and everything we feel. And that is called complete spiritual literacy. That is total immersion in God's grace. Now, I don't know anybody who lives in that immersion state all the time, but I know a lot of people who live there most of the time. And living immersed in God's grace is a sense of heaven on earth. And that is our goal. It's what we will experience when we move from this world to the next. But in this world, it takes practice. Now, the television show alone has participants who have yet to talk about their faith in God's grace. They talk about being spiritual, and they talk about the animals as a spirit presence, but none of them have yet talked about experience God's grace in the world around them. And I've often wondered if those who are overcome with loneliness would fare better if they were better at recognizing God's presence wherever they are. And I have to tell you, I'm not volunteering for the show to find out. But I do know that you and I fare better in our lives when we have the ability to read God's presence in what is going on inside of us and what is going on around us. Because God's grace is everywhere. We just have to learn how to recognize it. And yeah, it takes practice. Amen.
Amen.